Hey, what's going on everyone? In this video, I'm going to address an ongoing issue with one of the NPM packages that is introduced in Colt Steele's The Web Developer Bootcamp, and that is the request package. So some of you may know that request was deprecated. Some of you may not know that or just may not know what it means, but that's what we're going to cover in this video. We're also going to cover an alternative to request. So let's start out with the lecture where you first get introduced to the request package, and that is 283, making API requests with Node. And as you can see here, Colt is introducing the GitHub for the NPM request package, and I actually have the NPM page here. It has a link to the GitHub somewhere in here. Yeah, right here. So this page right here is actually what you'll see in the lecture, and it has information at the top about it being deprecated, and it has a link here that you can go to that explains everything about the deprecation. Meanwhile, the NPM page, which is similar, also has a deprecation message at the top, and then it has a link to the information about that. So from either the GitHub or the NPM page, if you follow that link, it takes you to a GitHub issue where the author of the package talks about why he deprecated it. And so if you don't know what deprecation means, it essentially just means that the package is no longer being supported. So in the future, it could potentially break and not be fixed. The reason that he did this in a nutshell is that it's using some older syntax. JavaScript is changing rapidly, and it's just difficult for him to keep up with. That's what I gathered from reading through this quickly. If you want to spend some time going through it, you can read more about the discussion, some of the comments, etc. He's actually putting it in what's called maintenance mode. That means that there's going to be some people who use two-factor authentication to be able to be contributors, and they will have publish rights directly to NPM. So it may be that other people help keep this project alive. Either way, if you want to read more about it, go ahead. Let's get into what can be done about the deprecation and what we can do as an alternative. So over here in the course, Colt is showing you how to make a request, what's called an API request, to a third-party API. In this case, he's doing it to the Yahoo API. And so you're essentially making this request from your web application, from your server, and you're saying, I want something, some data. And you send it to a place that is set up to receive those types of requests and then send you back a response in the form of the data that you requested, or if something went wrong or you requested incorrectly, then they'll send you back the appropriate error. And so in this case, we're using the Yahoo Weather API just to get some information about the weather in a certain place. In this instance, I think it's the sunset time in Hawaii. And so this is the file that you end up with after watching that lecture. Now, mind you, this will still work. So if you run it, node firstrequest.js, firstrequest.js is the name of the file that has this code inside of it, you'll see that actually, I said it still works. The Yahoo API doesn't work anymore, so we have a whole different lecture and a note about that, but I'll cover it in this one. So the Yahoo API was also what you could be considered deprecated. Basically, they started using a newer version. You have to get an API key, all this crazy stuff. This is logging the parsed data, and then it doesn't return anything. I don't know that you get anything back from the request. Briefly, let's just see if we get anything back. So just so you know, this variable var request is requiring the request package, and then you're using that variable with which is actually a method that allows you to invoke this function here to send a request to the first argument, which is a string, which is a URL to the API. You can see this is a crazy long URL. And then what you get back in this callback function is either an error, if there is one, this is called an error first callback, or the response, or the body of the response, just kind of as a shortcut. So let's just take a look at the response and see what we get back. All right, so we get back undefined. So basically that just confirms to me that that API, at least that URL for that API, is no longer being used. And that's totally fine. I'm going to show you how to use an alternative API and also an alternative package to request. So let's try to keep things moving along. There's an API called the placeholder API, and let's see if we can find it. Or maybe it's called the JSON placeholder API. There we go. I think this is it. And basically this is just kind of a way for you to check to get some dummy data if you want, or just to make sure that your code is working properly. And so this right here is just a quick example that you can run in your console. Fetch is an API that is native to the console, native to the browser, and you're able to just run it that way. So what I mean by that is if you were to open your Chrome console and then go to the console here and paste in this code, sorry it's so small, then you would get back this promise pending. Now that's doing a fetch to the URL then response.json. So it should have logged the JSON. Let's go ahead and go to that and just make sure that that's working. Here we go. All right, so this is the response that we expected. Without fooling with that, try to figure out why it didn't work. We do know that the API is working. If we go to /to-dos, we actually get an array of all the different to-dos that they have in this API. And it looks like there's quite a few. So let's go ahead and take that URL right there, and we're going to make a request to it in our code. So we're going to maintain the original code for request, but instead of making an API call to this Yahoo API, which is clearly broken, or not broken, but just not working anymore, discontinued if you will, we're going to put in a string argument here and then paste in this JSON placeholder. So I'll get rid of this console log here that says the sunset in Hawaii is at ... because that's not relevant to the API that we're calling. So now what we can expect if we make a request, which is a GET request, to this /to-dos route on this API right here, is we should get back some data with these dummy to-do items. So if we save that and we run our code, what we're looking at here is the entire response, which is kind of garbled and a lot of information that we don't need. So what we can then do here, this is saying if there's no error and the response status code is equal to 200, then do something here. Now we don't know if this is formatted the same way, but we can try it. So let's go ahead and just leave this code here. I got rid of all of these brackets because query results channel astronomy sunset is relative to the original weather API request, and in this case we're just making a request to an entirely different API. It does not have the same properties in the object that we get back. So if I just look at parse data, we should get back json.parseBody, which would be an array of objects that have information about these to-do items. So now if we go to the bottom here and clear this out, not familiar with the commands in Visual Studio Code. Okay, great. So immediately after running this file and sending that request, we get back this huge array. It even tells you there's 100 more items, so they truncated it, of all these different dummy to-do items. Great. So what you can see here is that request actually works. Now, what triggered this whole thing is that people, I keep running the same command and it's not going to work. There we go. People were running npm install request along with Colt in the video. And this is how you install it to your project in the no modules directory. By the way, you'll see this package lock.json that got generated. That's a new thing. It's not new, but it's newer than what you'll see in the Web Developer Bootcamp. And that's just a file that keeps track of the project versions that you're using, so that if someone else uses the same project, you guys aren't on two different pages. You're not using different versions of the packages. So you can totally ignore it. It's not something you ever have to look at or edit. It's just something that happens in the background. So back to what we were talking about here, I just did an npm install request. And if you look at node modules, now mind you, it was already installed. It came with this project that I downloaded from Colt's source code, but I just installed it a second time. So here it is, requests, this package, and that's inside node modules. That's not a folder that you'll ever need to go into and edit stuff. I just wanted to show you that that's where it gets installed to. But this is what students were seeing and saying, hey, request is deprecated. And then you can actually go to this issue right here. That's the one that we reviewed a moment ago, if you recall, right here, that has all this information about the deprecation. Okay, so they thought, oh, warn, all these, not errors, but warnings, this is not good, this isn't going to work, what do I do? Well, as you saw a second ago when we ran node first request, it actually still works. So in terms of needing to do anything right now to be able to continue on with the course, you don't actually have to do anything. Now, when you finish with the course and you get out in the real world, you want to use stuff that is modern, up to date, and being used today, right? So while request works currently, it may not work in the future, and it has potential to break, so you don't necessarily want to use it to send requests in, let's say, a production level application for yourself or for a client. And so now let's get to the business of resolving this issue by finding an alternative package to use. So this is really a simple process. We're just making HTTP requests to APIs. This isn't rocket science, or as Fun Function says, he said something hilarious, rocket surgery. It's not rocket surgery. Okay, so it's really simple. We just need to find an alternative. Lucky for us, there's plenty of alternatives. And one of them is going to be a package called axios. So we're going to look up axios npm. Here it is at the very top. And you can see here this little subheader. It's promise-based HTTP client for the browser and Node.js. Great. Now you can go through here. Oh, mind you, it has awesome compatibility with all these different browsers, as you can see. So you can go down and you can see the usage. The first thing they have is installing with npm, which is what we're doing. So let's go ahead and install it. Npm install axios right here in our terminal, and that will install it to our project. Okay, this warning that you're seeing is not in reference to it being deprecated or anything like that. I know it looks similar to the other one that we had before. What this is saying is, hey, there's no package.json file for us to save to. And so that's fine. It actually installed it in Node modules. Up at the top here, you can see there's the axios folder. But a lot of NPM projects are going to have what's called a package.json file. You can fix that by doing an npm init-y. And so what that'll do is it'll generate a package.json with a bunch of default values. This is the APIs. It just took that from the directory of the folder that we're in. The main file, it just took the first JavaScript file it could find, in this case the only file, which is firstrequest.js. And now it's got dependencies. Well, you can see the dependencies here are axios and request. So it's smart enough to know from this file, from the commands that we were just entering, what needs to go in here. Now we're not using request anymore, so we can do an npm uninstall request, and you'll see this file gets updated live. So it's gone. Now all we have is axios. And now if you came back and you did an npm I, which I is just short for install, you can do I or install, axios, the name of the package. Now when it installs, you can see the only warnings we have are about no description and no repository field. So if you wanted, you could go in here and say, learning how to make an API request with axios and express, something like that, in the description field in your package.json file. Now, as far as the repository, we don't have a GitHub or any other cloud-based repository to connect this to, what's called a remote. And so that warning is going to stay there. So even if you install it again, which at this point you don't have to keep reinstalling it. I'm just doing it for the point of showing you like which warnings we can mitigate and which ones are going to maintain. So there's only one warning left at this point, and that's just saying that there's no repository field. You can totally ignore that. Later on, if you want to connect your package.json to a remote repository, you can, but that's totally outside the scope of this video. All right, so let's keep things moving along. We can close our package.json file and go back to our first request. Now, mind you, we're not using request anymore. So let's go see how to use Axios. And just so you know, instead of just like saying, hey, request is deprecated, here's the package you should use. It's called Axios. Here's how you install it and use it, and making a 2-minute video, I go through this whole process because this is the stuff that you as a developer should be doing. You don't need someone to hold your hand. So, and rather than holding your hand, I'm showing you like this is the process that I would go through. And so hopefully you can learn from this, and then next time you see an error like this where it warns you about a deprecation, you can go to the link on the GitHub. You can read the alternatives. You can do a little bit of Googling, and you can do the exact same process that we're doing in this video so that you don't need someone to hold your hand, because ultimately you want to be self-sufficient as much as possible, especially when you get out in the workplace. That way, when you really need help and it comes down to the wire, you can get help from your coworkers or from people on the internet. But for stuff like this, you'll know, oh yeah, all I need to do is just do a little bit of digging. So back on track here, you can see we can install it with npm, which is what we did, so we can ignore the other stuff here. And then down here is the example usage. Now this is a note for common JS usage. In order to gain the TypeScript typings, blah, 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 you can import with require using the following approach. So this right here is not something that we're doing. We're not using common JS. So instead, you just want to do a GET request. That's const axios is equal to require axios. Very similar to what we're doing here, right? var request is equal to require request. So we paste that in. The only difference is we're using the const keyword as opposed to var. Const is basically just the new version of var. There's actually two of them. One of them is called let, L-E-T, and then there's const. There's two different ways that you should use those. Check out Colt Steele's video. I'll link to it in the description. A bunch of people on YouTube have videos, but his is pretty thorough, and it explains to you how and why we use const and let now instead of the var keyword. Great, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that request code. There's some older code up here from the lecture. I'll get rid of that as well. And so what we end up with is const axios is equal to require axios. And now we have this variable axios, and that's what we're going to use to make this HTTP request in place of having used request before. All right, so if we go back over here, the next thing is just say axios.get, and then you put in the URL to the API that you want to send the request to. And now you probably haven't seen this stuff here, this .then, .catch, .finally. And maybe you have if you worked with promises, but I'll go ahead and show you what that is. So it's really simple. It makes our life a lot easier. Essentially just means that this is a promise-based package, and it also means that we can use async await with it. So if you're familiar with async await, that'll make your life a lot easier too. But let's just do it one step at a time. So if we copy this code right here, and we go down here, we have this request that we were making before, and mind you, the second argument is a callback, but now we're using promises, which are a little bit different. So I'll paste this in. I'm going to use this URL here. So down here we have axios.get, and we're making this GET request to the API. So let's replace this little example URL that they have, which is just a route for an internal API. And now we have the request to to-dos. And just so we're not getting back a ton of data, I'm going to change it to to-dos /1, which will just get us back one to-do item as an object, as opposed to an array of hundreds of to-do items. All right, great. So when you send this request, the next thing is we wait for a response. So once we get that response, .then will handle what happens then. So then we get the response back as an argument to this callback function, and we can handle what happens when we get back a successful response from this API. Otherwise, if we get an error, we want to catch that error. So we have this .catch. Now this is called chaining, method chaining, if you will. And so we have a .get, which does the first thing, and then we have a .then, which does the second thing. This handles the success of our request. And then we have a .catch, which handles the error if there is one. And then we have the .finally method, which it gets executed no matter what. If there's a success or if there's an error, we have the ability here to do some type of logic, whether or not it works or it doesn't work. So we're not going to use that in our case, but just know that you have that ability. So if you want, you can just leave it there. You can take it out. It doesn't matter. All right, so let's get rid of the code that we have up top here for requests. We're no longer using it. And let's give this a shot. If we just save this file and run it, let's see what we get back. So we'll do node first request.js right here, and it sends back the response. Now the response has some data here. You can see that that's that user ID, title, ID, completed. That's the API response like that we were expecting, right? The to-do item. But there's other stuff in here that is part of the response. It has headers. It tells you what type of method it was, what the path was. So we don't necessarily need all that. What we want is the data part. So let's see what happens when we do console log response.data. And we clear this out and we run it again. This time we're just getting back the data that we expected. And so if you wanted, say, the title or the user ID, then you could log console.log.response.data.title. And if you wanted the user ID, you could duplicate that and get the user ID. So here's the title and then the user ID of 1. And so you can already see very easily we can replace request with axios. And the syntax is a little bit different. We're using .then and .catch. Mind you, if there was an error, it would have got logged here. In this case, it's a success. We don't have an error. I don't know, maybe if we change the URL, put an A here instead of a number, maybe that'll give us an error. Let's try it. Okay, so it looks like this is probably the error object, which has a lot of information here. It has a status of 404, status text is not found. So you could parse this error object and you could get back a lot of useful information about why the request did not work the way that you wanted to. So if we put it back how we know it's supposed to be, of course, then it's going to work. We get that title and that user ID. All right, so that is it. If you stopped watching the video now, that'd be fine. But if you want to stick around for a minute, I'll show you basically how I would do this. So with axios, this is funny, I've actually never used axios before this video on the back end. I think I've used it on the front end, although I typically try to use fetch. But seeing that they have promises, that makes me instantly want to use async await, just because I like that syntax a little bit better. And so if there's a .then, that means that this right here, axios.get, returns a promise, a thenable promise that we can catch an error for. And so if we get rid of this stuff right here and we do a try and then catch and we console log the error, this could be error the full word or just ERR. I like to put ERR for short. That's totally up to you. And now axios.get, we would await it and we do something like const response is equal to await. Now watch what happens when we try to run this. Go ahead and save it. You can already see this little red thing down here. I think that's part of the syntax highlighting feature of VS Code. But if we run it, we get an error and it says await is only valid in an async function. And so normally you'd be running this code probably inside of a route with Express. And so that would look something like app, that's not what I want, app, here we go, .get, and then some route, and then you'd have rec, res, and next. This is an arrow function, by the way, so you may not recognize that if you're not familiar with arrow functions. Please look them up. They're very simple to learn. This is a callback right here with the request object, response object, and then next. This also would not work unless we made it an async function. So now you're inside of an async function and you can use await. That's why they call it async await. Well, if you want to briefly see what this would look like if you use the original just regular function syntax, it would just look like that. You basically just take the function keyword, remove it, and then put this arrow on the right side of the arguments, and now you have an arrow function. So this is how you would do it if you're in Express, or if you had a router, you would do router.get. But in this case, for the example, we are not using Express. If you're at this point of the course, you may not even know what Express is yet. So just so you can see, we can wrap this in an async function. And so the way we do that is we use an immediately invoking function expression, or otherwise known as an IFI. And so inside of this parentheses right here, the first one, we can do an async function. And then we can put our code inside of it. Now notice there's something special about this function. I made it async, and therefore now we can use the await keyword. This doesn't have to be just a regular function. If you wanted, you can make it an arrow function. And this second set of parentheses outside of the first set just means that this async function is going to get invoked the moment that this part of code is called. So when I run this file, this async function will get called right away, and then this code will get run simultaneously. So assuming that I did this right, which I may not have, we can run it, and it comes back without any error. That's great. Now on the next line, remember we have the response here. So if we do console.log response.data, what do we expect? We should get back an object, right? There it is. So this is the same thing that we had before with the other code, except now we're using async await. So it's a little bit different in terms of the syntax. So just to expose you to it, if you've not seen it before, definitely look up async await. Plenty of videos on YouTube and lots of great documentation and guides and blog articles, etc. online. Definitely something that I would recommend adding to your repertoire if you are a JavaScript developer. Basically just lets you write async code in a more synchronized fashion, which is great if you're coming from a language like Python or Ruby, something like that. Okay, so what did we get from all this? Request, the npm package is deprecated, meaning it's no longer being supported in the way that it was before and could potentially break in the future. So we needed to find an alternative. We chose to use Axios. There's some other ones. Feel free to look them up if you want. In this case, Axios is a promise-based API, and so whenever you send a request with it, you can then handle the response with a thenable whatever you want to call it, .then chaining thenable promise. And so this right here is the async await version. Go ahead and copy that and go back to the thenable promise version just so that you have both. And give me a second to back up. Great. Okay, so here's the thenable promise version, and then here's the async version. So if I invoke these, you'll see the first response and then the second response, which is funny that the second bit of code is what's returning the object, even though it came back first, and then up here this one is showing the title and the user ID, but it came back second even though it appears first. And that just goes to show you that unless you structure this code the right way, then there's no way to guarantee when the data will come back. And so that is, if you wanted to make sure that this code down here appeared second as opposed to first, then you'd have to put this block of code inside of the .then callback, meaning first handle this, then do something else right here. All right, so I'm going to try to make this make more sense. Let's see here. Oh man, there's a shortcut, but I completely forgot what it was for fixing the syntax indentation or formatting automatically. In any event, let me just open this up and zoom out. If you want to take a screenshot, go ahead and do that now. This is the async await version down here at the bottom. And then this is the thenable promise version up here at the top. And that's it for this video. Hopefully you learned a little something. I know it's a lot of information, so hopefully what you take away is that if you see a deprecation warning in the future, you can just do a little bit of Googling and find a nice alternative and then play around with it and figure out how it works from the documentation. If you have any questions, you know what, you can leave them in the comments below. I don't know that I'll be able to answer. I've been super busy lately, but hopefully some other members of the community can help you out. Thanks a lot, and we'll catch you in the next video.